Hello and welcome back to Switch and Lever. Today we're going to make something which has been on my to-do list for a long time, and with spring approaching, I ask, is there a better thing to make than a skateboard? I won't bore you with the history of skateboards, but instead, let's just dive into designing our board. This board is going to be a small skateboard, reminiscent of a penny board. The shape itself will be similar to a cruiser longboard, but much smaller and with a kicktail in the back. We're going to start from an already pre-existing skateboard, whatever the cheapest knockoff pennyboard brand I could find at the store. The deck of these boards are made from plastic, and you want to start off by removing it completely. The only thing you're after are the trucks, which share more commonalities with longboard trucks than those with regular skateboards. Due to the shorter deck of the pennyboard, however, they do ride a bit different, and is a lot lighter to bring with you. Make sure you keep all the screws and nuts and set everything aside for later. To make this pennyboard inspired skateboard, we're going to be pressing and laminating an entirely new deck from layers of veneer. To do so, however, we need to start off making a mold in which to press our veneers. In this case, we're going to use MDF to make our mold, but you could use chipboard or even regular wood if you so desire. Start off by cutting a bunch of pieces roughly bigger than your final skateboard will be. Also make sure they're at least as long and as wide as the veneers you will be working with, so you don't have any overhang when gluing. It makes for a much easier time clamping the mold together. Since this is a fairly simple shape and the only bend in the veneers is at the kicktail, the mold can also be fairly simple. Here we're gluing together 4 layers of thick MDF into one slab and 2 into another. These will serve as the top and the bottom of the mold, with the board in between. After the glue has dried thoroughly, you can mark out the angle you want for your kicktail on the top of the mold and cut it off. Make sure you don't, like me, use a woefully dull bandsaw blade or your experience will be a bit tedious. Go slow and go steady. Once the wedge is cut off, you need to affix it to the other part of the mold. A bit of glue and a couple of screws should do the trick nicely. Proper alignment is key, so the mold will close properly during gluing. If we can add a clamp across the curve in the mold, we will be able to press the veneers together much better at that point. To that effect, drawing a line that bisects the angle of the cut, and then 2 parallel lines gives us a guide for where to cut away a little bit more material, which will give the glue clamps enough purchase to really put some pressure on that bend. And yes, that bandsaw blade really should be sharpened or replaced. Smooth off the cut surfaces on both the top and the bottom of the mold to remove any saw marks, and round off the edge on the top part of the mold to ensure a nice smooth bend in the kicktail. Finally, to protect the mold and to prevent your veneers from being glued stuck to the mold, cover it in packing tape or something else which will resist any glue squeeze out which may occur. I probably don't need to tell you how much it would suck if you glue your mold shut. If you have very long pieces of veneer, you may want to cut them shorter ahead of time, both to save glue and to make the glue up go a bit faster. Just make sure you still leave enough material to fit your board design. This is 7 layers of maple veneer, which has 5 layers with grain running along the length of the board and 2 layers with grain running across, to make sure it has rigidity in all directions and won't split during use. This excellent veneer was donated by Raw Rocket Skateboards Europe for use in this video. I do suggest you check out their products if you're at all interested in building your own skateboard. They also have a great vacuum molding system, which is definitely worth the investment if you plan on making a few boards. The glue we're using here is Titebond 3, mainly because it's a very fluid glue that also has a longer working time before it starts setting up, making the whole process of applying glue and clamping much less stressful. Applying the glue to the veneer is best done with a roller, and you don't want to just slather the glue onto the veneer. Apply a thin coat, the veneer should just be shining with a thin sheen of glue, that's enough. If it's dripping over the edges, you're using far too much glue. Also make sure you're applying glue to both sides of the veneer before placing together to ensure good coverage. If you have too much glue on your veneer, it may cause weaknesses in the final board, which may cause it to break prematurely. Remember that you're on the clock though, and you really don't want this whole glue up and clamping to take much more than 10 minutes in total. Start by adding clamps across the kicktail bend. Now you can properly see why we cut out a little bit of MDF in those areas. From here, go on to add all the clamps you have. I'm even breaking out the bar clamps here, since they are the ones which will give the highest pressure out of all the clamps I have. Don't be stingy though, add all the clamps you have, or at least that you can fit. Nice even pressure across the mold will ensure a great result in the end. You may even be able to use ratchet straps if you don't have enough clamps, as they should give good all-around pressure on your mold. If you've done your glue up correctly, you should have little to no squeeze out from in between the layers of veneer. Now rest, you've done enough for one day. Let the glue do its magic and come back tomorrow.
The very next day.
I know you're excited, so let's get to it. Remove all those clamps and gaze at the wonder you've made. A bent piece of plywood. Of course, a piece of plywood a skateboard does not make, so let's move on to the actual design. Print out your design on multiple pieces of paper and tape them together before cutting it out so you have a template of your board. I marked the location of the bend on the template, so lining that up and taping it down to the plywood was very easy. Mark the holes where you will later drill and mount the trucks, and draw an outline all around your template to transfer it onto the plywood. Follow your lines as closely as possible on your bandsaw, while still leaving about 1 millimeter or so on the outside. Try to cut it as perpendicular to the board surface as possible. When you get to the kicktail, angle the board up so the tail lays flat on the table. On a belt sander or disc sander, take off the last millimeter of material and smooth out any roughness left by the bandsaw. Since you're sanding end grain on some layers, regardless of how you hold the board, you're likely to get some darkening of the board due to heat, but that's not too much of a concern. If you have access to a router or a router table, the next step should be fairly easy. Install a roundover bit into your router, set the height properly and round over all the edges of your board. This may introduce some more darkening of the edges, but still don't be too worried. If you don't have a router, you could use files and sandpaper to round over your edges, but doing it with a router ensures that they get a little bit more uniform. Depending on the quality of your veneer, you need to sand the top and the bottom surface of your board as well. If you have an orbital sander, this work should go quite quickly, but even by hand it shouldn't take too long to get done. The raw rocket veneers are quite nice, so not much sanding was actually needed. To take care of the burn marks from before, sand down the edges and make sure that the edges blend nicely into the flat surfaces. I started with 120 grit sandpaper to get all the marks out, and then 240 grit to smooth everything else out. As long as you didn't sand too deep, you should still have the marks we made for drilling left on the board. You can mark them again to make it a little bit easier to drill them out. The best way to drill these holes are no doubt with a drill press, as you get nice and perpendicular holes through the board. If all you have is a handheld drill, that works fine too. Just try to be careful you're drilling square and hitting your mark. Putting a block of wood on the bottom also helps to prevent blowout, which may mar the finish of your final board. Using a piece of scrap that you cut away earlier from the board, set the depth stop of your drill press to the right height for the countersink. You want the heads of the bolts to sit just ever so slightly below the surface of the board, so there is no risk that they snag onto anything. Setting the depth stop ensures that you don't go too deep, and therefore your bolt not being solid enough in your board. The more material you can have between the heads and the trucks, the better. A light sanding once the countersinks are done smooths out any grain which may have lifted when making the holes. We're almost done now, just a few more steps. Using a few spare bolts, washers and nuts, make 4 posts, one in each corner of the board, to elevate it slightly off the ground. This will enable you to easily varnish both sides of the board at once, without having to wait for one side to dry before flipping and doing the other. I'm using a polyurethane varnish, and rather than doing one thick coat, I'm doing plenty of very light coats instead. With light coats, it's much easier to control the final quality of your varnish, and you have a much less chance of unsightly runs and drips in your varnish. You can even thin your varnish with up to 1/4 mineral spirits to make it spread more easily. After you've done both sides and checked for drips, wait for a few hours before moving on to sanding. Indeed, even though we just varnished it, we're going to sand it again. This time we're using a 600 grit sandpaper just to knock down the high spots of the varnish. This may be from bubbles or any grain which may have risen. You don't even need to bother removing the sanding dust from your board, as that will actually help to fill in any uneven areas when the next coat goes on. Add another layer of varnish, just like the first. Wait, and then sand again. Repeat this process until you've built up 4 to 6 layers of varnish. I usually don't sand between the last 2 coats, as that way, if I miss something in my last coat, I won't end up with a dull spot in the varnish. After everything is completely and thoroughly dry, usually after 24 hours or so, you can remove the hardware. Unscrew the nuts and remove the bolts from the board. The washers may still be a little bit stuck into the varnish, but that's really no problem. This is a switch and lever public service announcement. Always remember to choose the right tool for the job you're doing. Even though the tool which is closest at hand, like a utility knife, may seem like the ideal tool to remove washers stuck in varnish, it's really not very clever to use a very sharp tool where a dull one will do. If you still manage to stab yourself in your hand or your finger using a utility knife, apply immediate pressure. Hold your hand high to reduce the bleeding and try not to panic. Hold pressure for a few minutes before assessing the injury. If the cut is deep enough, do go to the hospital. Otherwise, clean it and apply a band-aid. Once all that is done, go get a blunt screwdriver and carefully remove the remaining washers from your board. Of course, to ride your board you're going to need grip, so let's apply some grip tape. Before the grip tape goes on, clear out the countersinks again just to make sure they're not gummed up with varnish, especially those that did not have bolts in them. Since this board is mostly just flat with one little bend, applying the grip tape should be very easy. Remove the backing from the grip tape and start in one end, slowly working the tape gradually down the board. Take a piece of the backing and rub the grip tape down on the board to make sure it's stuck down well. To get rid of the excess grip tape, take a metal rod, like the shaft of a big screwdriver, and rub it along the circumference of the board, creating this crisp, bright line all around the board. We do this essentially to remove some grit from the grip tape to make it easier to cut off. Taking a utility knife, like the one you hopefully did not stab yourself with, or a razor blade, run the blade through the grip tape from the bottom of the board and follow the line all around the board. It may take you a few boards until you manage to get the hang of getting a nice crisp cut around the board. Like you can see here, I didn't do too good of a job, but as long as it's on there and it looks decent, you're golden. To make sure the edges are less likely to lift during riding, you can take a piece of the grip tape that you cut off before and gently sand down the edges of the grip tape, blending them a little bit into the board. Use something sharp like a drill bit and poke holes into the grip tape where the holes for the trucks will go. I would also recommend cutting away the grip tape that's just around the countersinks to make sure that the bolts seat all the way down and don't protrude to the surface of your board. Once at this point, you basically just have to put your trucks onto the board and get ready to take it out for a spin. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I would again like to extend a big thanks to Rocket for making this video possible. Hope you all enjoy spring, ride safe, and respect the power of utility knives. If the weather is poor or your varnish is drying too slow for your taste, check out some other videos from Switch and Lever. Also, you know the deal, follow on Facebook, Instagram, it's what the cool kids do, I guess. Until next time!